Welcome to Taverns, Politics, Tories, and Patriots. This is Melinda Cole Klein. Some historians have argued the American Revolution began in colonial taverns up and down the Atlantic seaboard. This is a logical argument because of the role of colonial taverns in general. These public establishments were where men gathered to talk business, politics, and to hear the latest news. Taverns served important roles in government, justice, politics, and commerce. Colonial taverns, like their European counterparts, were establishments that served the needs of the community, travelers, and their horses. They served food, refreshments, and offered accommodations to both horse and rider. And it would be these public spaces that colonials from the Carolinas to New England met and engaged in conversation. This war would pit family members against each other, depending on their political ideas and loyalties. While American students are familiar with the heroism and patriotism by colonists who fought in favor of independence, an exclusive focus on this minority population does not offer a complete view. Students in America are less familiar with Tories or British Loyalists, who lived and worked alongside other colonists or are part of the same Patriot family. Benjamin Franklin is a good example. He is considered by many to be the first American patriot. However, his son remained a Loyalist, a longtime royal governor of New Jersey. Families across the colonies struggled with their loyalties or wanted to stay out of the political and military chaos that impaired their ability to survive economically or conduct business. At the time war commenced, 70% of the colonial population was either loyalist or disinterested in the Patriot cause. Ideological differences set Patriots apart from the majority of the population, and the Patriot numbers increased through practices of intimidation, while others destroyed private property to those loyal to the Crown or disinterested in the Patriot cause. Throughout the War for Independence and immediately after, Tories, also known as Loyalists, met with almost universal hostility. Thousands left for Canada, the nearest British colony. Runaway enslaved Americans joined the British cause as they were promised their freedom after the war. Other American colonists who decided to stay on, advocating their loyalty to liberty in colonial newspapers, pamphlets, sermons, along with speeches, found their physical lives threatened by Patriots, their property vandalized, and their livelihoods ruined. New England, the middle colonies, including Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, and the southern colonies of Maryland, Delaware, Virginia, Georgia, and the Carolinas, were united with their aggravation over the Stamp Act of 1765. It did not end here. They were further frustrated with the Townshend Acts of 1767 and its revised version as the Tea Act of 1770. With the Coercive Acts of 1774, the British government sent her navy to Boston Harbor, which stopped all shipping until the colonists paid for the destroyed tea. In today's money, this is about $700,000. The other 12 colonies believed such an action by their government could become their fate. They watched Massachusetts anxiously. At the end of the year after the Hutchinson affair, colonists feared what may come next. Because British-American colonists had, by custom, avoided paying their full share in taxes and trade duties, this resident population had enjoyed distance from the empire and its government regulations on trade. By the 1760s, under the leadership of King George III, the government, in desperate need for revenue to pay down the debt from the 7 Years' War, argued they would have to impose direct taxes on the colonists, a few pennies here or there, on popular imported goods to raise funds. In addition, the government desired to catch smugglers and end this customary practice of avoiding paying taxes. Over a colonial period of 150 years, colonists had been accustomed to paying taxes based on local collective consent of those with voting powers. However, direct taxation does not allow for consent. It mandated policies to be followed for the health and well-being of the empire. Colonists on the American mainland south of Canada began to argue, as they were not represented in Parliament, these acts were made without their consent, in essence a violation of the English Constitution. In time, the new British direct taxation policies, in their view, violated their citizen rights. Meanwhile, others cried it would break them financially. This Patriot dialogue supported economic actions such as boycotting British imports or shipping their colonial goods to England. These actions developed into a resistance in America to anti-business laws. This characteristic, in which distance is preferred between government and the economy, was an underlying factor of the American Revolution. In creating the government of the United States after the war, the government and its supporters pushed for industrial growth and economic expansion with a low tax base to allow the private sector to grow. This worked. From the 1780s to the election cycle of 2008, going until 2010, excluding Presidents Theodore Roosevelt, FDR, and Obama, Congress and Republican presidents in general are less likely to establish government regulations over private business practices because it limits economic growth and wealth. An independent, market-oriented, capitalist economy has been strongly supported in the short history of the United States. However, some private industries could affect the global economy and merit some regulation. U.S. privately owned businesses have been periodically regulated depending on the political tone. Starting with consumer products, Theodore Roosevelt encouraged business reforms as he viewed business in general as so corrupt, owners were unconcerned with the quality of products they produced, driven exclusively by profits. This resulted in the Clean Food and Drug Acts of 1906. Next, increased regulation of the banking industries after the crash of Wall Street in 1929 under FDR created social legislation to protect working Americans. FDIC in 1933. Next, in the 1980s and the 1990s, there was a savings and loan crisis with almost 800 institutions having closed their doors due to failure. This thrift and loan not-for-profit lending institution by type made affordable home loans to mainly working-class Americans through saving programs by depositors wishing to purchase a home. After World War II, the thrift and loan movement grew. But from 1966 to 1979, Congress began to set limits on interest rates. This undermined the amount of interest depositors could earn. This led to new strategies to keep savings and loan customers. But by the 1970s, the industry was in trouble. This led to a $125 billion bailout by President George W. Bush, in which the taxpayers foot the bill for the failure. The fourth item. By 1990 to 1991, the nation was knee-deep in an economic recession. New homes did not sell. High unemployment abounded. This financial crisis led to deregulation of the banking industry, making it easier for lower-income working-class Americans to purchase homes and enjoy lower interest rates on monies borrowed. The last item I want to mention here, number 5. The Tax Reform Act of 1986 led to the imprudent real estate lending, qualifying millions of American homeowners by offering adjustable rate mortgages for the first 3 to 5 years of their loan, to which a homeowner could later refinance the loan for a fixed mortgage rate when their home had equity and before the higher interest rate began after the initial period was over. Such imprudent lenders in California included Countrywide Mortgage and Washington Mutual Bank. Unfortunately, the real estate bubble burst by the fall months of 2005. In many areas, home values decreased by 35 to 50% of their original purchase value. This did not allow millions of Americans to refinance their homes as promised. Millions walked away from their mortgages and homes by 2007 and 2008 because of the home values that now their home was worth. This undermined the worldwide stability of the banking system, creating epic losses by banks and private persons, resulting in yet another U.S. government bailout. Yes, the American Revolution was fought for the separation of the state and the economy. And hopefully our present-day politicians know their history and uphold our hard-earned rights. After all, the purpose of government is to protect its citizens from domestic and foreign threats. What transpired in the dark corners of a tavern? We may never have the entire story. But what has come down to us as a partial record are through tavern songs written down that illustrate colonial views. Tavern account books and journals offer a picture of tavern businesses. All the while, colonial records and newspapers offer additional sources of information on the role of taverns prior to the American Revolution. Colonial taverns in the 13 colonies, like those in Europe, were regulated by government authority. A tavern owner, man or woman, needed a license to operate. Sales tax had to be paid by tavern owners to their local authority, like other businesses past and present. Men, the customary patrons, used tavern space for a range of public activities. Number 1, to conduct business. Number 2, to collect or send mail, relax and unwind. Number 3, for the traveling salesman, seaside or inland traveling trader, itinerant preacher, justice or magistrate on his court session rounds, the tavern was a place to eat, stable and feed his horse, and to sleep. Colonial taverns served as meeting houses for town selectmen, such as those in New England. And number 5, taverns served as places of justice in villages and towns across the colonies to decide the fate of local lawbreakers. Accommodation laws. In the tavern, food was available for purchase along with drink, such as this pleasant potato meat entree swimming in gravy served with a local porter or ale, and a choice of bread. Tavern fare, past and present, is hearty, warm, and filling. It typically lacks spices or heat outside of the use of horseradish. George Washington's homebred porter was so popular among guests, he sold it to his friends. Most colonial wives or housekeepers became quite efficient in brewing beer. Because water and milk were not yet safe to drink, beer was considered the safest beverage, and it cheered one up at the same time. Thomas Jefferson had a brewery on his estate. Ultimately, in hope of creating a national brewery and for the sake of posterity, George Washington donated his porter recipe to the Library of Congress. Boston brewer Samuel Adams made a George Washington porter. This was laced with licorice using English hops and smoked malted grains. For a while, but I understand it is not being currently produced in bottles for resale, only at the brewery this is likely available today, the Sam Adams Brewery in Boston. As the British colonial period advanced, colonial spicy foods and flavors from India were integrated into the British diet. But historically, British tavern fare has been simple, but very good and filling. The English, Scots, and Irish, like their European counterparts, were big meat eaters in the colonies and produced beer from ancient times. For this reason, it would be common to see homemade sausages. English sausages are called bangers, and also German brats, and would also include roasted local game, including rabbit, on our tavern menu. Tavern fare, to protect customers, was set in accordance with local custom and to colonial maximum fixed prices. Why was this? Colonial magistrates and politicians recognized the temptation for unscrupulous tavern owners to charge unusually high prices to hungry travelers. To avoid this, and as not to take advantage of them away from home, most American colonies set maximum prices for a 3-course meal and drink. 1 ounce for spirits, this would be rum and whiskey, 4 to 6 ounces for wine and ports, 10 ounce for cider, and the 20-ounce British pint for beer and ale. However, in America, a modern pint of beer and ale is regrettably set at 16 ounces, unless you ask for a sterling pint, to which you will receive the classic 20-ounce British serving. In taverns, you would also find non-alcoholic beverages, including hot tea and coffee, by the cup or pot. Some colonial seaside taverns hosted hot chocolate or a variety of local pastries and cakes. There were colonial laws requiring tavern keepers to provide a bed, horse stables, and food for a range of appetites, established prices as well. Drink could and did range anywhere from types of punches and cider to beer, ale, brandy, wines, some with flavorings, while hangover remedies were available for the ill effects of drink consumed the night before. Like in Europe at the time, free time belonged to those who could afford it. In the case of taverns, these public spaces were regulated at the colonial level and that of a particular town authority. By regulating acceptable clientele, fixing prices, and discouraging vice or disorder, colonial taverns served their range of purposes. The colonial tavern evolved from its medieval model of hospitality. Access. By definition, like citizenship at the time, access was tied to those entrepreneurs who managed their own lives, such as business owners, politicians, those in commerce or trade. Those who were not acceptable because their time belonged to others were the following and were typically excluded: students, children, wives, laborers, and slaves, the unmarried youth, the indentured, and the apprentice. And across most colonies, selling alcohol to Indians was usually against the law. Why did men across the ranks create their own taverns? Yes, it would be common in a larger village or town to see a few taverns, in which the clientele would range from the unruly and high-spirited seamen to the gentlemanly establishments. What entertainments might a tavern patron find inside the establishment? This ranged across the colonies depending on if the tavern was in a colony established to control moral behavior, or a tavern located in a colony that did not strive to regulate moral behavior, such as those in the Chesapeake area of Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, also the Carolinas as well, as an example. In the southern colonies, you would likely find gaming, including dice and cards. Since darts were considered a marksmanship skill, a military game of skill, darting games were played across the colonies from New England to Georgia. In taverns of New England, a tavern owner might be fined for being open on Sunday. Conducting business on Sundays was tightly regulated in New England, or hosting gambling games, considered a sinful waste of time. While tavern patronage was the same across the colonies, tavern activities differed, and so did each colony's approach to a legal and acceptable definition of drunkenness. Massachusetts, including former independent settlements of Plymouth and Salem, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and in the Quaker colony of Pennsylvania, were founded on religious principles. These colonies aggressively sought legal corrections made against people acting in a morally deficient manner. In these colonies, drunkenness or disorderly conduct was pursued legally. In New England, it was most aggressive. Punishments may include the following: dissolution of the family. Children would be apprenticed by the town authority to well-ordered families, and these parents could be bound to serve as servants in other households or were encouraged to leave altogether. Next, while crime and poverty was very low in New England across the colonial period, banishment to other colonies could result as the town found offenders unfit as residents. Next, monetary fines. And lastly, raising public awareness of criminals. Criminals, both adults and or children, could serve time spent in the town square, in the stocks, or the pillory because of their sinful behavior. Public notices would be posted for all to read. Prosecuting moral behavior was costly. This was not the practice in the colonies of Virginia, Maryland, and the Carolinas. At what point in the southern colonies could you find yourself on charges of drunkenness? I've listed 6 points here I would like you to think about. Number 1, not after falling down drunk in a tavern. Number 2, not after forcing himself sexually on one of his own slaves or apprentices. Number 3, not after purchased sex from a local madam's house of ill repute. In modern times we call this prostitution. Number 4, not after a round of dueling pistols in which the gentleman was forced to protect his honor after a scandalous comment, and perhaps he killed his opponent, in which he restored his honor. Number 5, not after failing to pay his bills on time. And number 6, not for attracting unwarranted public attention to himself or causing a public nuisance. But a drunk could be arrested in the South, depending on his status and rank, after he/she produced injury to private persons or private property, depending on the property or rank of the person assaulted. Then legal sanctions were warranted. Southern elite society considered their activities above the law, and this perception was common in Europe as well. After all, it was the Southern elite society that made the laws, right? Since gentlemen as a breed of men across the colonies were considered indifferent to physical temptations, these were the corrupting influence of drink and illicit sex or gaming, their social rank protected them. Colonial regulators blamed social inferiors. The slave, the Indian, the apprentice, the foreigner, the disgruntled worker that strived to enjoy illegal activities, along with as much wine, women, and song as their incomes would allow. The application of gentlemanly discipline to social inferiors living in their household, apprentices to servants or slaves, was expected by all. In Southern plantation cultures, social restrictions in regards to access to leisure activities were limited to men of independent wealth and business. This was custom because most of the colonial population was busy in their family economies most of the time and had little time for leisure or recreation in general. Historically, the condition of drunkenness as a lifestyle was considered a problem of the lower orders, such as slaves or the working class, or other unhappy individuals in their private lives. While drunkenness was seen by colonials as a problem, lawmakers across the colonies were most interested in controlling the sale of alcohol and collecting colonial revenues. Each colony received profits from an excise tax that was obtained from all legal sales of alcoholic beverages by town taverns and wholesale distributors. In the colonial mind, especially in New England, idleness was a sin. Several colonies were concerned with the amount of mischief within them, their promotion of idleness and debauchery, which forced customers to misspend their time in drunkenness. While Virginia rarely prosecuted colonials for drunkenness, this society was more concerned with the protection of private property. They did not regulate moral behavior as fiercely as New England lawmakers did. The characteristics of Tories, often referred to as Loyalists, were common among the population in their attachment to all things English. They did not comply with encouragements to boycott British imports. Like Patriots, some Tories were intellectuals. Others lived and labored on farms, looking for practical results. And similar again, some were radicals willing to die for their convictions. They covered the spectrum from apprentices to wives and mothers, while some were wealthy politicians. The common misconception was that Tories were a group comprised mostly of wealthy elitists. While many people commonly assumed Tories were aristocrats loyal to their king, this was not so. They came from the gentry class. This is middle-class merchants and traders, non-aristocrats. Farming communities as well. They worked as sailors, craftsmen, and blacksmiths, to mention a few. Thus located across the colonial society. They were settled sparsely along the western frontier areas, along the seafaring middle colonies extending from the Hudson River to the Chesapeake Bay, and areas north. It is commonly believed, though not true, that they were in the majority living in Massachusetts and Virginia. Tories lived in New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware, along with Maryland. Tories did not have concentrated populations in seaport towns of Philadelphia, Boston, and New York City. During the early stages of the Revolution, Tories provided a moderate leadership which devoted its energies toward diluting many of the Patriot proposals. After the fighting began, they attempted to bring about reconciliation between Great Britain and the American colonies. One Loyalist statesman, Joseph Galloway, serving as a Pennsylvania delegate to the First Continental Congress, argued that they should agree upon a plan to bring harmony between the colonies with her king. This became known as Galloway's Plan for Union. A man before his time, he supported the creation of an American Parliament allowing for the colonies to have more representative powers over the course of their affairs. This plan would keep the colonies within the empire, but would give them dominion status, like enjoyed later by Canada and other Commonwealth countries. Thomas Jefferson was in favor of the plan. Seemed like a logical and sound move, but the First Continental Congress did not approve it to be presented to Parliament as they struggled to find a reasonable solution to colonial unrest. All the while, the existing First Continental Congress operated in secret, as they had no legal footing as a political body. All were committing treason by meeting in the first place. Once the political influence failed of Loyalists, they turned their attention towards helping the British in America. They supplied British soldiers and sailors with food and supplies. Tories served as spies and guides to the British Army. Printed counterfeit continental currency to drive up inflation. Loyalists organized and led Indian attacks on frontier families. Loyalists formed their own battalions and fought alongside British soldiers. It is estimated 30,000 Tories volunteered to serve in British regiments. In 1780, when George Washington's men numbered 8,000, over 9,000 Tories served in the British ranks, along with regular soldiers. If a person was suspected to be a Tory and did not leave their home in the colonies, what might happen to them? First of all, the colonies passed a variety of laws which required oaths of allegiance. Tories were denied voting rights. These Loyalists had their lands confiscated, which was sold to pay for war expenses. As an example, in New York, over $3.6 million worth of property was acquired by the colonial government. Tories were punished with whippings, branding, cropping of ears, this means cutting them off, and confinement to the pillory. Rarely was a Tory executed. Those who crossed over to the Patriot cause their lives were spared. Whereas the Patriots were a minority in the colonies, why did the Loyalists fail in their goal to maintain peace and unity of the 13 colonies with the British government? As noted before, I mentioned John Galloway and also have listed it on this slide. In addition, as you can see here, Loyalists did not effectively organize their political opinions in the press because Loyalist print shops were broken into and property damaged. And lastly, Loyalists were subject to violent acts committed by their neighbors, and they feared for their safety. A Tory legacy. It is estimated that 100,000 Tories immigrated from the American colonies to some other part of the British world, mostly to England and Canada. However, hundreds of thousands swore allegiance to the Patriot cause once their homes and lives were threatened by their neighbors and hometowns. In this section of your lecture presentation, I argue it was men of words and men of action that began the war, kept it going, kept it focused and on track, and brought it to a successful end. This effort included outspoken to violent radicals, moderates, and men with tactical skills, along with intellectuals who articulated well-developed ideas. Additionally, the roles of the colonial press in swaying public opinion, along with the colonial tavern as a public space, cannot be understated. With these colonial institutions, communication would have suffered. While the underlying causes of the American Revolution were many, the issue of government control of the colonial pocketbook loomed large. Consider the following factors. Number 1, anti-business tax policies imposed by a faraway imperial authority. Number 2, if all patriots had been like Patrick Henry or Sam Adams, the revolution might have failed. If all the patriots had been like Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, or John Adams, it also might have failed. It was their combined diversity which produced success. Number 3, patriots varied in their wealth and experiences. Some were lucky or at the right place and the right time or with the right group of people. While about 5% of the colonial population, the majority of patriots that I've categorized as men of action were the majority. They contributed in a physical way to bringing a win to the war. And number 4, motives for resisting imperial authority was articulated best with the line of argument, quote, "No taxation without representation," end of quote, which gained momentum during the 1760s and continued through the Revolution. Review this slide for its content and meaning.